Welcome, everyone. My name is Parwana Ayub, and I'm an Environmental Equity Policy Fellow at the Greenlining Institute. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists for taking the time out of their day for what we hope to be a fruitful and timely conversation about building resilience at the intersection of climate change and COVID. And before diving into the program, I'd like to invite everyone to take a moment of silence to honor and pay respect to all the lives we have lost to COVID-19, who are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and the ongoing racialized violence on Black people, such as the recent murders of Ahmed Arbery and Breonna Taylor. Thank you, everyone. After over 2 months into a shelter-in-place order, we are deeply immersed into the practice of physical distancing to slow the spread of the COVID-19 virus. This current crisis not only lays bare the flaws and shortcomings of our current political and economic systems, but also foreshadows the devastating global impact and disruptions that we all will face if the ongoing current climate crisis continues unchecked. In this moment, we find ourselves at a fork in the road with the choice to make about not only how we respond to the current crisis, but also with the choice to make about not only how we respond to the current crisis, but also how we apply these lessons to address the threats of climate change. So today's conversation will focus on what building community resilience looks like in the face of multiple and intersecting threats. Climate change and COVID are indeed different crises and challenges, but they do share some important things in common. With both crises, frontline communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted, both in the immediate aftermath as well as in the long-term economic fallout. There are a lot of narratives in the media calling COVID-19 the great equalizer. However, not only is this label false and misleading, it's also harmful for communities on the front lines of this pandemic. From disproportionate mortality rates and lack of access to testing to high rates of job loss, with each passing day, more and more information comes out showing that Black, Latinx, Asian Pacific, Pacific Island, and Indigenous communities are being hit hardest by COVID, and they have the fewest safety nets to fall back on. Similarly, climate disasters like wildfires, droughts, and extreme heat events also impact communities of color and low-income communities the first and worst. And these communities often have the least material resources to cope with climate threats. Overlapping systemic policy failures are one of the primary reasons why communities of color and low-income communities are being hit hardest by COVID-19 and climate change today. The conditions that made our communities vulnerable to the virus in the first place, like extremely high levels of pollution resulting from disproportionate sightings of polluting facilities in communities of color, poor infrastructure, lack of green open spaces, and poor health and economic security, are a direct result of decades of historic and systemic racist policies and practices like redlining. So it's no accident or surprise that frontline communities are being impacted at such disproportionate rates. And so with each passing day, it is becoming more clear that we need to think simultaneously and holistically about both crises and threats. Future climate threats such as wildfires and extreme heat events stand to worsen the unequal health and economic impacts that communities of color were already experiencing and that are now exacerbated due to COVID. So we must ask ourselves how we can support frontline communities now in the face of COVID and climate change, while at the same time think through solutions that create long-term sustainable and equitable systems change to address the root cause of these crises. Only then will we have a real chance at building a just, sustainable, and resilient society. And today we have an excellent panel of experts who can help us unpack the intersections between COVID-19 and the climate crisis, and share some challenges and opportunities they're seeing to address both crises. So with that, I'd like to pass the mic over to Greenlining's lead on climate adaptation and resilience, Sona Mona, to start the conversation. Sona, over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Parwana, and welcome again to our session on building resilience at the intersection of climate change and COVID. My name is Sona Mona, and I'm a senior policy analyst here at the Greenlining Institute on our environmental equity team, and I'll be moderating today's panel. We're honored to have three incredible speakers with us today. We have Daryl Sarmiento, who is the Executive Director for Communities for a Better Environment, Corinne Van Hook Turner, who is the Director of Climate Innovation at the Movement Strategy Center, and Rita Kampalat, who is the Sustainability Programs Director for the County of Los Angeles Chief Sustainability Office. Thank you so much for joining us today, Daryl, Corinne, and Rita. So I'd love to open up the discussion by having each of you share a little bit about yourselves and the work that you're doing for our audience. Can each of you start by sharing what motivates you to do the work that you do? And to lay the foundation for our audience, can you also share some of the work that you're doing in communities around climate change and how COVID has impacted that work? And we'd love to start with you, Daryl.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here. Thank you, Sona. It's great to be on this amazing panel with Corinne and with Rita. I'm Daryl Molina Sarmiento with Communities for a Better Environment. And what brings me to this work, why I'm motivated to do this work is, my family, my community. I grew up, going and visiting my dad's village, which is a coastal community in the Philippines. And we are protected by, and every few years, we have to continue to support our family there and rebuild that seawall with every increasing typhoon. And so climate change has been really like a big part of my life since I was a little girl, and my family's life, and their survival depends on our ability to work on these issues. I also had the opportunity to go back and visit communities in the Philippines impacted by the toxic waste from the US military bases. And it was also around that same time that I went on my first CBE toxic tour. And that's when I really realized that what's happening in the Philippines is what's happening here in California in environmental justice communities. And that's why I continue my work. I started at CBE back in 2005, and CBE is a statewide environmental justice organization. We focus our work in the frontline communities that are disproportionately impacted on the front line of toxic industries and extractive industries. And we build power and organize in the communities of Southeast Los Angeles and LA County, and Wilmington, part of the city of Los Angeles, East Oakland, and Richmond. And we do that through our organizing, through our legal work, and through our science and policy work. And so, as we know, our communities, of course, are the ones that are hit hardest by COVID-19. We've read the Harvard study. We know what's been happening. And so we've had to really pivot our work during this time to focus a lot on mutual aid. And we started a community fund to support EJ communities during this time, because we're also ones that don't qualify for the various assistance programs that are out there. And so we really work to integrate the organizing that we do on the ground with the mutual aid work that we do to really support and provide collective care for our communities during this time.
Thanks so much, Daryl. Rita, I'll turn it over to you next.
Great. Well, again, thanks for having me here, and it's great to see all the interest in this topic. In terms of motivation, I guess it might be a little bit of a cliche, but I guess the first thing that I thought about really was, my kids, family again. Having sort of a personal connection always helps. I mean, it's a hard question. My motivation's definitely changed over the years, but that's definitely most recent. They're getting to an age where they're really starting to notice the world around them and asking really good questions about why there are some of the things they're seeing in their community, why some people have things really differently from what they do and other people around them do, why there's so many inequities. And, you know, it's a really hard thing to explain, to have to explain as a parent, you know, just why there are those inequities, why adults don't always follow the same rules that they're being taught about how to treat each other and how to treat the world. So that's something that's definitely made my work more poignant, is trying to just try to create a world where I feel better about what I'm reporting to them day to day, and that there's some good news to share, progress and things like that. So as far as what our office is doing, just as a little bit of background, we were created relatively recently for, you know, county history-wise, by our Board of Supervisors, and our main goal was to create the county's first sustainability plan. And, you know, I don't want to get too deep into the sustainability plan, but the plan had several through lines. It's very comprehensive, but there were several topics that really came up as being so fundamental to the concept of sustainability in the county that we felt like they really needed to be embedded throughout the plan rather than having separate chapters. And two of the things that kind of come up are equity and resilience. Those are really drive so many of the actions we felt were so important to a sustainable county, that they are kind of there's a piece of those topics in every action. So, you know, more specifically, some things that have come up for us in terms of climate are a community climate action plan, which is in draft form now, and will be going to our regional planning commission later this fall. And then also another effort that we're kicking off called a climate vulnerability assessment, which is going to be happening over the next year. And that will really be looking at climate impacts, especially to some of our most vulnerable communities, and focusing on that. All of that obviously has been really impacted by the COVID crisis. And one of the things that we're really thinking hard about, and I am excited to hear the conversation, especially with my great fellow panelists, about what community engagement looks like for those big efforts as we're kind of moving through this, and it's a constantly changing thing. In addition to that, I'll just say that, you know, a lot of the county's focus has really shifted to that emergency response. So that's definitely impacted how we think about our priorities. My office, some of my colleagues in particular, have been pulled onto a food security task force. So, you know, we look at food policy and food access as a big part of sustainability, obviously. And so that's become a big focus for us during this time.
Thanks so much, Rita. Appreciate it. And I know so many folks in the county are extremely busy right now. So just extra, you know, thank you for being here today. And Corinne, I'd love to hear from you as well. If you could share a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing at Movement Strategy Center around climate change and COVID.
Yes, thank you so much. Hey everyone, good afternoon, buenos tardes. I don't fluently speak Spanish, un poquito. As on social media, you've seen like that meme where it says Latinas that can't speak Spanish are kind of like the Burger King taco. And I'm like, I'm the Burger King taco. But then my friends are like, no, you're good. So yeah, even though it was my mom's first language, I didn't learn it. And so there is a little sense of shame, but you know, I try, and you know, my kids haven't been able to learn it. But you know, I'm from the Bay. I was born in Oakland, but you know, to a Black and Native father, Puerto Rican mother. May she continue to rest in peace and power. Raised throughout the Bay, and also I'm currently living in Vallejo now because the cost of living and affordability is ridiculous, as I'm sure some of y'all know here who are joining me in the Bay. So I find myself having to move, and I found like further and further out. So I've been here for about 5 years. I'm a wife and I'm a mama of 4 beautiful growing humans. They're my heart and core to my purpose of why I do the work, and also, you know, what drives me, even when they drive me crazy. But beyond this, a little more about the why in terms of the work that I do, in terms of how I got in, and also with Movement Strategy Center, is that I often say is, as a woman of color, Black, Latina, Afro-Indigenous, I am this work by my existence, my experience, my people, and my history, right? So if we think about the Sankofa moment, you know, really just standing on the shoulders of my ancestors, and then looking forward into the future, my children and my children's children, and even just seeing all of you, amazing, you know, leaders, just being on the panel, and then I'm seeing a whole wave of experts in the chat. Like, I'm energized and activated by knowing that the work that's actively happening in our communities, and it's already been named by Rita and Daryl, is really does embody, and it lives into bold vision and transformation of what we need now, even if it's not feasible under the existing conditions for it to actually be possible, but we're on our way there. And so with Movement Strategy Center, MSC for short, just to kind of give you a little background about the organization, our mission is to cultivate the power necessary to accelerate a just transition from a world of domination, extraction, and violence, where the few live at the expense of the many, to the world of interdependence, liberation, resilience, and where the many govern for the benefit of all of us. And really, you know, what that means is it's critical to center Black, Indigenous, and people of color to actually kind of have that at the fore. And a lot of my work has been and is actively working to, with that kind of governance structure, shifting traditional top-down planning, traditional top-down power and policy making, and transforming and shifting power and governance to marginalized communities who are Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, LGBTQ, elders, immigrants, undocumented, young people, and those with disabilities. And so one of the things that, before I even joined the organization, I've been with MSC for 3 years, formerly director of Bay Localized Rooted in Resilience that we sunsetted. In 2014, there were conversations about how are we actually changing fundamentally changing how planning happens, and actually this work to shift power to our communities. And we came together and we developed what MSC pulled together as a community-driven climate resilience planning framework, which is essentially the center and core of how I do my work. It's the intervention, right? Both in terms of making sure that communities are at the table. So what that looks like is supporting, for example, a community anchor partner, whether it's a resident leader or grassroots organizations doing racial, economic, and environmental justice work, to intervene and divert what they might need, such as funding, leadership, design, decision-making power within any city and community partnerships, so that they can work with them to inform policy and programs. And often the reason why I say that that's important is because our communities get tapped so much for our expertise, and it's not valued in the same way as if you have like a technical contractor or an expert, and our expertise actually needs to be valued. So it's really part of making sure that if policies and programs are going to be designed to supposedly benefit us, they need to be designed for us if that's even going to happen. So certain partnerships currently in my work, shout out to Partners Poder. I see Michaela on the line, people organizing to demand environmental and economic rights, and Emerald Cities Collaborative San Francisco, who are throwing down on decarbonization work, which they see as central to a just recovery, both in terms of the positive health impacts of electrification, and also particularly on respiratory illness, so that we can be positioned for economic stimulus in a way that rebuilds and transitions our economy to one that has climate and health at its center. Another thing specifically to COVID that I've really been trying to encourage and help grassroots organizations as well as government think about is how to shift their work given COVID rather than stop it completely, especially when how communities organize and do engagement now needs to look very different. And now the tech divide in terms of access is a real thing, which makes it hard to lean into the not so relevant idea of this narrative we hear around we are in this together, and even more realistically, the idea of physical distance and social solidarity, even if that's kind of more so what it is, can be challenging for some that have relied on hubs to provide these types of access to these resources. So again, I'm going to shout out to organizations in Portland like Verde, who are grappling with this with their partners and the community and finding creative ways to organize and thrive during not only this time, but they're, as experts, right, in their working with communities, they're already preparing for the next moment like this. Because what this moment is teaching us is that this is just one moment of a pandemic, of many exacerbated crises that we've experienced before, we're experiencing now, and if we don't get it together, we're going to continue to experience.
Thanks so much, Corinne, and everyone. Truly honored to be here today with such an impressive group of speakers. Appreciate all of you for sharing the incredible work that you're doing in communities around the state and the strong commitment to equity that you have and to uplift priority communities that are being hit really hard right now by COVID and climate disasters. So now I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into how we can intentionally bring equity into our responses to address COVID and climate change. With COVID, what we're seeing is that while the pandemic affects everyone, the impacts dramatically differ depending on who you are and where you live, whether you have a good job, access to healthcare, stable housing, and paid sick leave. And as Parwana mentioned, many of the same communities that are being disproportionately hit by COVID are also on the front lines of climate change. So recognizing the dual crises that our communities are experiencing, we have to prioritize equity more than ever. And so I want to ask each of you, how do we make sure that our policymakers and government officials make equity and racial justice real as they address COVID and climate change, so that equity is not just a promise or a talking point, but that there's an actual strategy and equity lens that they're bringing to address these crises? And I'll start with you, Rita.
Great, thanks. That's a really challenging question, obviously, because we haven't figured it out yet, certainly. But you know, I'm heartened by seeing more of an interest from policymakers in that topic, at least talking about it. That's definitely not the answer, but that's something. And I think that comes from the fact that they're hearing more and more from stakeholders. I'm speaking mostly for the LA region and the county, but you know, I know that we have some really incredibly powerful and savvy organizations, such as Daryl's and others, who are continuing to engage and getting the ear of some of our policymakers. And I think, you know, they really listen to what stakeholders are saying. I think one of the challenges is that, you know, we need to see more and more of stakeholders getting engaged in these topics, especially around climate, since we're talking about climate, where we haven't traditionally seen, you know, stakeholders and organizations who really have an equity lens. And this has been touched on. I mean, it's putting it on the burden on the stakeholders, which is hard. But ultimately, I think Corinne mentioned this, but it requires support, right? And support for those engagement strategies. So, you know, I think we really need to work hard within the county, but also have our partners push for community engagement to be built in right from the beginning of budgets for projects. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be just something that we say that we're going to do, but then don't realize how much investment it's going to take to do correctly. So, you know, we've luckily had a few models in the county that have seemed to work pretty well in terms of that, but they did require investment. And so hopefully as we kind of move on and policymakers are really seeing the benefits of those kinds of models where we are partnering with CBOs to do the engagement in their own communities and getting much more robust feedback and involvement, it's going to lead to better outcomes and become more of the state of the practice of what we do. Another thing that's been great is definitely in the county, I've noticed we've had a lot more, you know, cross-pollination, I guess, where people from who have experience in CBOs are actually coming to work for the county as well. And I think that's been really impactful as well. But you know, definitely the budget is where the rubber hits the road, and we need to see that kind of investment being made as like sort of a critical piece of project development.
Thanks so much, Rita. Corinne, would love to turn it over to you and get your thoughts on how do we make equity real in this moment?
Thanks so much, Rita. Echoing a lot of kind of what's already been said, especially that last point you made around having CBOs that are now working for the county. I think that is, when we talk about like inside and outside strategy, I think that is certainly like an amazing example, because they're bringing that expertise to figure out how to actually navigate the existing structures and push those boundaries. So like that's one thing that we certainly need. Another thing is, stop talking about equity as if it's an optional ingredient that can be modified or substituted, or racial justice as a campaign that can be won and cured with a few policies, programs, or trainings, even if that's all that is needed. You know, it's not like a surgery. You know, you can't say, oh, I did this and I got cred and I got a racectomy or whatever, and now I'm an expert and I'm cured, you know. And in the time of COVID, right, this case would be like a vaccine. So again, what it requires is an ongoing commitment to capacity building. And that's going to take time. And that time can't be predetermined, because everyone, both whether city, local government, organizations, they're all experiencing different scales, right? And so policies, trainings, programs, etc. are tools for that, but they shouldn't be understood as the solutions themselves. So if we know that race, for example, is a social construct, and the history of our economy and the systems that have built on that, making them systemically racist, even if unintended, then what is needed is a reconstruction. That should be the goal, because no matter how much we dress it up, the foundation is still the same, and it's still a broken system. So another thing is transparency. If you don't know, say you don't know. If Black, Indigenous, people of color are not part of every step in leading, design, and decision-making capacity, and their expertise isn't being resourced and valued, then it's not equity and it's not racial justice work, bottom line. They need to be more than tokens and informants, and there needs to be an understanding that healing, building connection and trust is essential, and to be demonstrated actually in action rather than commodified. And one thing to say about, I mean, for an example, it's one thing to say Black, Indigenous, people of color are doing amazing work and we should support them, even if you have no idea who they are because you don't know them. And it's another thing to say, I recognize and I'm committed to working on my privilege in all the ways that it shows up, and use that to shift power and resources to the extent that it could help build capacity for Black, Indigenous, people of color to lead, and ultimately being okay with designing ourselves out and understanding our right roles.
Thank you so much, Corinne. And Daryl, I'll turn it over to you.
First, I definitely want to say that we need to support and pass community-based solutions that center people, not corporations, at every level of government. And I definitely echo what Rita has said, what Corinne has said about inside and outside strategy. We need to be on the streets and also into the seats of power, into the government agencies. Our people need to infiltrate all of these spaces and hold these levels of leadership as people coming from the frontline communities. For us, we also know that we're going to continue to hold our governing bodies and our agencies accountable, and not just passing for environmental and climate legislation, but also centering equity also means supporting moratoriums on eviction notices, prevention of utility shutoffs, rent freezes, rent forgiveness, food security. All of these issues are intersectional, and really understanding the intersection of all of these issues that impact our communities that are on the front lines. And what we're really recognizing now in order to ensure that equity is centered is that there's a deep digital divide, and we're really feeling it and experiencing it now. So how do you expect frontline communities to participate, to give our voice, to participate in these public processes when we don't have the access to internet, we don't have the access to the technology to participate in this? And so we also really need to address that and ensure our ability to, even at the basic level, participate. And when we have that participation, we need to actually have meaningful input and access to providing input. And so if things need to shift in terms of the way it's structured and allowing public participation, in allowing our folks to have the time and access to engage in various decision-making policies and processes. And we need accountability at every level of the government, of the government agencies, because the polluters haven't stopped polluting. The polluters are deemed essential businesses, and they continue to impact our communities every single day. And so, we haven't experienced the clean air that people are experiencing. In fact, when you say shelter in place in an EJ community means a very different thing. And so we need to ensure that equity is, again, not just a buzzword, but how do we actually have the ability as frontline communities to be at the table, to have our voice heard, and dictate what's happening.
Well, thank you so much, Daryl, Rita, and Corinne, for sharing some really important insights and strategies on how we can all think about making equity real in this moment and in the work that we're doing. I know folks have been sharing different resources to supplement the points that you've been raising. So hoping that our attendees that are watching are able to reflect on these ideas and bring them into the work that they're doing. So now that we've sort of set the foundation for thinking about the relationship between climate change and COVID, I'd love to ask each of you some specific questions about the work that you're doing. And Daryl, actually, we'll start with you for this one. So CBE does a lot of incredible organizing work in environmental justice communities throughout California that are located next to oil and gas refineries and other polluting facilities. And because of this, our EJ communities have been breathing dirty air and already experiencing asthma and other respiratory illnesses that make them especially vulnerable to COVID. And yet at the same time, we're hearing that the EPA is relaxing air pollution enforcement mechanisms during COVID, essentially giving polluting facilities a license to pollute, which will only increase vulnerability to COVID, especially in EJ communities. So I want to ask you, through your work with CBE, can you share what's happening on the ground in response to the EPA deregulation orders?
Sure. And I'll just start by saying that, this deregulation of EPA and Clean Air Act and all of our environmental standards have started once Trump has come into office, and it continues during this time of COVID-19. Very specifically around his more recent orders, we have been working nationally with our allies to push back against the EPA. One thing that we're asking for is a federal rulemaking procedure around these particular cuts or lack of enforcement. And EPA recently said that they're going to prepare a rulemaking process, so we're going to continue to monitor that. We're also understanding that it needs to be an effort at the individual state level as well. So we've also supported and put together a letter for each of the governors' associations saying that we need them at the state level to continue to enforce. We need to ensure that there is continued monitoring, reporting, and enforcement during this time, especially at the state level, especially when we're experiencing this lack of leadership at the national level. And so, not only, and once we started doing this, we realized that it's really not just Governor Newsom, but really Cal EPA, and also the California Air Resources Board, who, the polluting agencies are governed by a network of jurisdictions. And so we need to address them at all levels. And one thing that we're also noticing that that's currently happening is that even though this is happening at the federal level with their aggressive rollback of standards, this is also happening at the state level in California, where we know that unfortunately big oil and polluting industries have the ear of our regulators, have the ear of our elected officials. And so, very specifically, the governors may revise. There are proposed deep cuts to environmental programs, environmental funding that we need to push back against, that we need to ensure that what we fought for years that we finally got does not get rolled back during this time. So one thing in particular is, we fought for the reshifting and reorganizing of DOGGR, which is a state agency that regulates oil drilling in the state of California. We got them to shift its mission to CalGEM, and they had, funding from the polluting industries, it wasn't even coming from the state budget, but ensuring that there were new positions within that agency to ensure that there's actual enforcement and protection of people's health, rather than just rubber stamping oil drilling to continue all across California. And in this recent May revise, all those new positions were cut, even though they were budget neutral completely. And so we need to continue to push back against that anti-rollback, not only at the federal level, but really what's happening at the local level. Like I mentioned earlier, there has already been, it's been botched what's happened in our local communities. If folks know about Exide, the battery polluter, the battery recycler that contaminated thousands of families in the Los Angeles area with lead poisoning, that was a completely botched cleanup process through the Department of Toxics and Substance Control. So we've already experienced lack of enforcement, lack of accountability from the government agencies on so many levels. And we need to ensure that even, especially during this time with the federal rollbacks, that we actually need monitoring of what's happening. We need an account of any polluting facilities at the federal level that will seize their, that will increase their emissions. We need to have documentation of every emission increases that are happening during this time. And we also need to ensure the protection of workers during this time, because the workers in these industries need to be safe. And with the impacts of COVID, we know that folks have been stepping in that are not necessarily the traditional working force of those facilities, like oil refineries. And so we need to ensure that those folks are have that training and that safety training in order to operate these facilities safely during this time, because our community's health, our survival depends on it.
Thanks so much, Daryl. Yeah, I think we all felt incredibly angry and frustrated when we heard about the deregulation of pollution standards. And so really appreciate you sharing how folks are fighting back and demanding justice and laying out some very clear action items and next steps that folks can think about to address this issue. So really appreciate your thoughtfulness there. And so Rita, this next question is for you. I would love to get your perspective as someone who works in local government. Both during the pandemic and in climate conversations, there's a large spotlight on what the federal government is or isn't doing. And there's also a lot of energy at the state level and with governor leadership. But we know that a lot of the real implementation work happens at the regional and local level, and it requires a lot of data collection and coordination between all levels of government. And so we'd love to hear from you through the work that you're doing with LA County. What insights can you share about the coordination with the state and federal level in the face of compounding crises, COVID and climate change? You know, what are some challenges that the county is experiencing in this moment, and what are some opportunities?
Thanks. Well, the federal side of things is pretty easy. There's not a lot of coordination going on there, certainly not on climate change. On the state level, it's a different story for sure. Some of our work has been actually supporting the state in terms of climate against some of the federal rollbacks. So doing things like adopting the state's fleet policy in the face of the lawsuits regarding like emission standards and things like that. We've also worked with the state, sort of talking about the nexus between climate change and COVID right now, really working on recommendations for stimulus asks. I think Daryl touched on this a little bit, but about the need for, looking at what is happening to workers who are displaced during this crisis, and then as we're also trying to, move to a carbon neutral society, what that's going to do to certain jobs, obviously. And so, we've worked with the state on recommendations to, put in place training for transportation electrification, for instance, and how we can make sure that people are trained for those sort of new green jobs of the future, and that we're also targeting specific communities and making sure that they have access to that kind of training. So, you know, again, like I think Corinne said, rebuilding to some extent, as we have an opportunity now. How do we do a better job of making sure that opportunities are open to everybody for those hopefully really good jobs, good and green, resilient jobs. You know, in addition to that, you know, we've worked at the state on a resilience bond, and within the county itself, again, kind of related to workforce, we recently have been looking at some measures that we passed. Some folks are aware that we have, our voters passed several funding measures, Measure W, which was related to stormwater, Measure H to deal with our severe homelessness crisis, A for parks, and then M for Metro. And we were actually pushed very much by stakeholders to really look at how we can leverage those pots of money and make sure that they are being used effectively, that projects are, you know, are being guided by community wants and priorities as well. And also that we're making sure that we're able to leverage those funds against state and federal funds. So our board created a committee that is, again, something that our office has been heavily involved with, to really talk through some of those policies about how we really are ensuring that we're directing those resources and those investments in a way that are going to also address some of our equity issues. So that's been exciting, and it all happened sort of in the middle of, it started before the pandemic and is continuing throughout. And so we're also, you know, in the middle of conversations about how that process can really set us up to, you know, for a recovery post-COVID in terms of, again, workforce training and other opportunities like that. In terms of challenges, yeah, we're having a lot of challenges because of the pandemic. I think I alluded to this before. It's really shifted priorities so greatly, and I'm sure everybody's aware that there are huge funding and budget shortfalls. Even though, you know, there's a lot of talk about stimulus money that's come out and some of it coming to local government, you know, we're facing this dual impact of major budget shortfalls because our revenue is really heavily dependent on sales tax and things like that. While at the same time trying to provide more services for our community. The county does provide a lot of social services for residents. So that's been incredibly challenging. And a lot of local governments are facing furloughs, salary cuts, layoffs, and things like that. So that's a challenge. How do we continue those services? And also, I think, as some of my panelists have touched on all these great points, not look at these things as like sort of the luxury add-ons, but make sure that they still remain priorities, even as we're dealing with these shortfalls. And when we're paring back, that we're not paring back those really important aspects of our budget. So yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I don't know if some of you thought it's kind of funny, but one of our cities, the city of Santa Monica, is you know, facing really huge budget shortfall, and their city manager sort of famously resigned, at least locally famously. And you know, he had made some really interesting points as he resigned about the need for us to sort of rethink local government and how we provide services. And so, you know, you asked about opportunities, and I think that's where we do have a lot of opportunities, is thinking less about, you know, just reacting to crises, which is the way a lot of our departments have currently been formed, and really thinking about prevention and how we sort of intervene, especially with regards to homelessness and things like that. So I think that's the opportunity there. It's you know, it's painful how that opportunity has come around, but hopefully we are able to, you know, create space to sort of talk about how we remake ourselves after this in a way that that makes more sense and puts us in a better position to deal with some of these crises.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rita. Extremely important, helpful for folks to hear. And I think it's something that we should all keep in mind as we think about how we can support the work that our local governments are doing. And just wanted to echo what you said about, you know, being more proactive rather than reacting to crises as they come up. So I think we have time for one last question, and I'd love to ask this one to you, Corinne. So when we're talking about building resilience in frontline communities, we have to uplift the fact that our communities are already very resilient. They're able to organize, build social networks together during disasters and crises, and stay strong despite all of the economic, social, and environmental injustices that they're experiencing. And yet in this moment, as you've mentioned, and several of the other panelists have as well, we're facing challenges to movement building and organizing because we're unable to physically come together due to COVID, the shelter-in-place orders, and distancing. And so as advocates, leaders, policymakers, and practitioners who are all here today, how do we meaningfully practice community engagement and collaboration and build power in this moment so that the wisdom and lived experiences of our frontline communities are included and in strategies to address COVID and the climate crisis?
Thank you, Sona. I just want to, give ashe to Daryl and Rita. Like, so much of what you said is just so relevant, and just, again, appreciation to the experts in the chats. I see you. To a certain extent, I feel like we're preaching to the choir here, and I just want to honor and give deep appreciation to the work that you all are doing, both in terms of the last questions and certainly for this engagement question. You know, the invitation, you know, that I always like to give, and especially movement strategy centers approach to it, is really to invite, when we think about community engagement, to think about it more as community collaboration, right? That the very kind of basic idea of engagement can be understood as one-sided and transactional, when really, when the intention of what we want to actually be doing and to do authentically is that it needs to be relational to sustain. Because a lot of the works that we do, much of your stories, Daryl and Rita, much of the work that's happening in our communities is really about that social cohesion that exists within communities. And if that's fractured, then really not much can happen. And we do so because we've kind of built that trust. Whereas it's like, if I ask you to do something, we know that it's toward a shared goal. It's to better our communities, our neighborhoods, meet our needs. Whereas if we've experienced some sort of relationship where you're only asking me for something because it's what you need, and there's literally no awareness of, you know, how it might benefit me, then that's not true authentic engagement. So it's really just kind of like that basic understanding of collaboration, and really just making it be about relationships, which, I mean, we all inherently have that ability, right? And also practice and approach-wise in this moment, I mean, not much of what we've been saying around this model of collaboration should change, other than creative ways to think about how to navigate the digital divide, how to navigate literally the language barrier. And by that, I mean not just linguistically in terms of cultural language, but also like the technical language around planning, around climate, around all of these solutions, right? We need to make sure that that's accessible to the communities that it's gonna most impact. And really what it means is not freaking out in a bit, like in this moment of COVID, not freaking out and abandoning the work to respond to, you know, a crisis like this, essentially, because what you're doing is making a good excuse to prioritize relief efforts for a pandemic like COVID while continuing to overlook and invisibilize generations of racial, social, economic, and environmental crises that have become systemic over time. You know, there have always been large numbers of unhoused and jobless people without access to healthcare that are disproportionately Black and brown folks. And it's unfortunate and it's shameful that it takes a huge hit to the economy and the government, right? And what Rita was saying, to actually consider providing basic human resources, where now all of a sudden there's moratoriums on rent. Again, what Daryl's saying, we're needing more of cell phones, energy, water bills, exceptions to accessing government stimuluses now, and unemployment. Now we're seeing that contractors and small businesses can access it before, and that wasn't the case. And even though what's being offered is of course pennies and not sufficient and very scarce and hard to access and delayed, it's like, why does it take this moment to even be able to do that, right? Even when we look at essential workers on the front lines in the food sector, they're risking their lives for pennies. And now, because of school shutdowns, like working age young people, like our young people who we want and doing amazing work leading into the future, they're now forced to like take on these jobs just so that their families can survive. So this moment is reminding us that our economy and our systems are insufficient to properly withstand a crisis that will very likely come visit us again, and worse. And there needs to be a new infrastructure like yesterday, right? And so our communities have been and are creating that infrastructure because they've had to, and the we are in this together and the shelter in place doesn't really apply to them because they don't really have, you know, what they need. They have each other, right? And so a lot of the narrative that we haven't been seeing that's publicized in the media is that even with some of these supports with unhoused people, it's actually at the neighborhood level, people who don't even do this work in their organizations that are making sure that some hotels that are opening to provide resources to unhoused people are getting food because they're literally being treated like prisoners when they do, or coming together to get donations on like a crowdsourcing website to really be able to like help smaller communities and families. Like that's the stuff happening and going down that we're not seeing, right? And so one of the important things about engagement is that we truly have to be investing and building with these communities who are doing that work to help us design and decide what that infrastructure needs to look like, regardless of COVID, right? But even more so now because of it, if they're gonna thrive, right? Everyone can. Like if it works for them, everyone can. And so what it means is getting real about relinquishing control and power when it comes to decision making, right? So that's true at the corporate and government level, getting creative about how we're budgeting under COVID restrictions that require resources to be allocated to COVID by understanding that these crises, they're not mutually exclusive, right? And so doing so could actually help COVID, and beyond that, you know, really kind of be comprehensive because communities are already planning for the next one, as I had mentioned before. So one example of that is like, okay, if we're seeing, and I actually am seeing a lot of this in our work, counties have abandoned a lot of the work around governance and ownership in their environmental justice committees in cities. And so they're like, well, who made that decision? If the environmental justice committee is supposed to be community driven, clearly they didn't make the decision. So we've, in a sense, abandoned that because we said we have to respond to COVID. But what we've done is we've just kind of gone back to our normal habits that we know are not useful, right? And so we actually need to, what Movement Strategy Center, it's part of our community-driven planning framework. It's called Two Paths Up the Mountain, that we have to navigate the existing infrastructure, but also build the new. Because when we abandon building the new, then, you know, we're caught up in the harm reduction of what that existing system basically gives us. And so for a moment, Sona, if you'll just show the community engagement to ownership spectrum, if you could put that in the chat. I'm not sure you all have seen it or are familiar with this tool with Facilitating Power and Movement Strategy Center, but a lot of what I just talked about in terms of investing in that infrastructure and what it needs to look like. This spectrum is a tool that allows community organizations and government to literally check in about how they are at in terms of what their actions are for engagement, like surveys, polls, and what their actual intention is. So from a 0 to just ignore all the way to kind of like defer to community leadership, which means that when we're doing that on like a 4 and a 5 scale, meaning collaboration and defer to community ownership and leadership, what we're also doing is moving resources. So
thank you so much, Corinne. And yes, definitely we'll include a link to that resource that you just mentioned, and appreciate, you know, everything that you just shared, an extremely thoughtful and powerful response to a question that I'm sure is on many of our minds. And it reminded me of what John Powell said earlier this morning, that we really need to do physical distancing, but social solidarity. And I think you've really spoken to how we can embrace that. And I'm so sorry we're out of time today. I feel like we definitely could have spent another hour or more speaking with all of you, but appreciate you for taking the time to be here today for this time timely conversation, and for all of you sharing your wisdom, sharing your stories, and keeping us inspired and motivated to keep fighting in the midst of crisis. And thanks to all of our attendees who are able to join this session and our economic summit. I definitely encourage folks who are tuning in to learn more about the incredible work that CBE, the LA County Office of Sustainability, and Movement Strategy Center are doing, and to keep staying engaged in these conversations.